Hello, welcome or welcome back. My name is Amanda and this is my channel where I talk all about all sorts of fun nitty goodness. Today is a pattern roundup video. We're going to be talking about another great way to use up advent calendar yarn, scrap yarn, bits and bobs you have kicking around, which I guess is scrap yarn, but another great way to use those up, which is blankets. I have recorded one other video before about a whole bunch of different like scrap yarn-esque blankets. I will make sure that's linked down below. These are all new patterns though, so 10 new patterns of blankets. Great way to use up scraps. Very forgiving, very versatile. Really don't need to worry about gauge. They're a great project. They're definitely time consuming for sure. But if you're willing to jump on in and put the effort in and know that you're going to have a project that's going to be on your needles for a decent amount of time, I think it's a really great project to start. So if you think these patterns are up your alley, grab some knitting, grab something yummy to snack on, and let's jump on into all of these patterns. So the first blanket we're going to talk about today is the Triangles, Diamonds, and Squares Oh My pattern by Grace Akhrem. A fun little nod to Wizard of Oz, which I guess is really pertinent now that Wicked is out in theaters, which by the way I saw and it was amazing, but I won't get into that too much. That's more of a regular podcast thing. Anyways, this is a fingering weight pattern. It does have a gauge given. I'm going to say this now, and then I probably won't reiterate it throughout the rest of the video, but with all of these, gauge is kind of loosey-goosey. Some of them are made specifically for knitting with advents, and those I will make sure that you know, so that you know you might have to be a little bit more careful with your usage of yarn and your gauge because they're made to use up as much of the advent as you possibly can. But this one specifically is not. It didn't state anything like that, but I'll still give you the gauge that the pattern was written for, which is 20 stitches by 40 rows to get you 4 inches square of knitting or 10 centimeters square in garter stitch. So this whole blanket is knit in garter stitch. I think the majority of these blankets are, which I also really appreciate because that makes them a lot more mindless of a pattern, but this one is knit in pieces. So you're going to knit a whole bunch of different squares. It looks to me like the pattern itself, just from all the photos that are on the Ravelry page, is written just to do like half and half triangle type squares. And then once you've knit all of those, you can kind of lay them out and place them together however you want and seam them together. I did note here a lot of the sample photos are squares that are like half white and half colored, but there was also one on there that, and I'll try and maybe see if I can pop it on the screen right now. It was half like solid color and then half stripy, which I thought was really, really cool. And then you could use up even more of an advent per square. So a lot of different options with this one, a lot of different ways you can lay it out. There's no real this is the way you have to do it. In a way, this pattern is almost like quilting because you're making all of those blocks and then laying them out and then stitching them together. The pattern itself does have instructions just for a very small blanket. I think it's like baby car seat size, but again, because you're seaming all of those squares together, it's super easy to just make more and make the blanket literally whatever size you want. All of the blankets in this video are knit blankets, but if you're like me, you see some of the crochet Afghans and scrappy blankets and you fall in love with them, but you don't feel like crocheting. And this next blanket I think is a really good solution for one of those types of crochet scrappy blankets. This is called Safe Space by Skeinanigans, and it reminds me a lot of the crochet hexie blankets. This is another fingering weight pattern. I do think there are instructions as well in here though for DK. Yes, it has 2 totally different gauges for you. So for the fingering weight version, the gauge is 28 stitches by 52 rows. And for the DK weight version, it is 26 stitches by 48 rows. Both of those are in garter stitch. So this pattern is kind of another modular-y one. In a way, you're like making individual hexies and connecting them together. You could, if you wanted, seam them together, but the pattern itself does include instructions for joining the hexagons as you go. So you'll finish one hexagon, then pick up on the edge of that hexagon to create the next one. It also includes instructions on how to weave in your ends as you go, so you're not going to have to worry about a whole crazy amount of ends to weave in at the end of your project if you are not disciplined like me and just leave them all to the end. There are also instructions in this pattern for knitting full hexagons, but also half hexagons, so you can fill in kind of those gaps that you get at the edge of the blanket from connecting those hexagons. So if that's something you're interested in, that is available to you as well. If you're familiar with the Northeasterly blanket by Skeinanigans, this is, I would say, constructed quite similarly, just with different shapes. On the topic of blankets that look like they're crocheted, but they're not, the Kaleidoscope by Tin Can Knits reminds me a lot of the chevron crochet blankets, but it's knit. So this pattern is written for fingering weight held double to get you DK weight. I think you could easily just do fingering weight held single and adjust your blanket accordingly. The gauge for the DK weight though is 24 stitches by 20 rows in a garter chevron pattern. So it is garter, but there are some increases and decreases thrown in throughout that give you that chevron pattern. There are 4 different sizes available. A stroller size, which is going to give you a blanket about 27 by 31 inches wide. In centimeters, that is 68.5 by 79 centimeters. There's a crib size, which will give you a blanket 35 by 41 inches, which is 89 by 104 centimeters. There is a small throw size, which is 46 by 51 inches, or 117 by 129.5 centimeters. And finally, there is a large throw, which is 52 by 61 inches, or 132 by 155 centimeters. So lots of different options. They give you the stitch counts for each different size of blanket, so you can pick whatever size you want, pick your commitment length or your commitment time, how much you want to work on this blanket, how long you want to be putting stuff into it, and go accordingly. So with this blanket, one of the, I think, standout features of it is that there are no ends to weave in. You leave all of your ends and you tie them into tassels on the one side of the blanket. So there's literally no ends. And tassels, I think, are beautiful. You could braid them together at the end when you're done. You could just knot them like the pattern shows you how to. I think there's a lot of options for that as well. And while this blanket calls for, I think, like changing colors every, I don't know exactly from the pattern page, but I'm gonna guess like every 2 to 4 rows, you could just knit with a mini skein until you run out and then add in your next one and keep going. You would have some ends to weave in the middle of the blanket then, but you could use literally every little final scrap of the yarn that you have. So if that's something you're interested in, I think this blanket works quite well for that. Next, we have the garter stitch version of the Psychedelic Squares Afghan. This is a pattern by Sarah Bradbery, and it is a free pattern. So if you're looking for something that has literally 0 cost involved other than your yarn, this is a great one. This is a DK weight pattern, so you could knit it with DK weight yarn or with fingering weight held double, and it does have a gauge of 22 stitches. Doesn't have any row gauge. Honestly, with this one, I think your gauge is not very important at all. This is another blanket where you make as many different squares as you want and then connect them together. I think you could easily use a join as you go method if you wanted to, or you could seam them all together. It doesn't look to me that there are instructions in this pattern for how to connect those squares together, so it's kind of left up to you, but I do know there are a lot of tutorials on YouTube for join as you go methods or seaming. If you were to seam them, I would just use the mattress stitch. That one is the easiest to me, at least, so different options for connecting that together. And then there are 2 different options for square size, a smaller square and a larger square. So depending on how much yarn you want to use up, you can adjust that as well, or cast on either size, I guess. You could also stripe these differently than is shown in the pattern photo. You could do no stripes, you could do some with stripes and some without stripes. I think there's a lot of different options there as well. I would say this is more of a base pattern, and then you are meant to kind of use your own creativity and come up with something that you enjoy. The Zigzag Zen Blanket by Anniina Juuti is probably one of my favorite ones in this video. It reminds me of a log cabin quilt. I don't know, it's just really pretty. It's very simple, but I think it's also really striking at the same time. This one is designed for fingering weight held double to get a DK weight, but you could also just easily knit it with fingering weight yarn as well. It does have a gauge of 17 stitches by 32 rows to get 4 inches or 10 centimeters square of garter stitch knitting. And it does come in 2 sizes. So if you're wanting to achieve one of these 2 sizes exactly, you're going to want to hit gauge. Otherwise, I really think gauge is not that important in this one, unless you are trying to use up advents in exactly the way that the designer said. This is one of those patterns which does have a note about advents that I will mention shortly, but let's get into the sizes of the blanket first. There are 2 different sizes available: a baby or a lap size blanket, which is 39 by 47 inches or 100 by 120 centimeters, or a throw size, which is 55 by 63 inches or 140 by 160 centimeters. So this one is knit from the corner out. You start in one corner and then you alternate horizontal and vertical garter stripes to get the pattern. And the designer does note, while she does include the 2 sizes in the pattern, that the blanket itself is totally customizable. You just add as many different stripes as you want and keep going until you feel like the size is the perfect size for you. So I think that's really nice as well. You can use up as little or as much yarn as you want. It's not a set, this is what you have to do. There's a lot of room for playing and creativity, which I really like. The color combinations for this one are endless too. You could do every second stripe being a cream color. You could just have a totally random blanket and just pull balls of yarn out of a bag and see what you get next. You can do a lot of different patterning things with this. So many options. So like I said, there is a note for if you're knitting this with an advent. It says if you want to use an advent calendar, you will need to combine colors together from section 7 onwards. So I think what she means by that is that your stripes will have to kind of become 2 colors if you're using advent mini skeins after the 7th stripe that you put in. I don't think she means, or maybe she does mean holding it double because it is meant for fingering weight double. She could mean that for the first 7 stripes, you just hold 1 mini skein double, and then after that you have to marl 2 together. Either way, there are so many different options for this. If you don't want to use mini skeins, you probably don't have to think about that whole aspect of the blanket, but lots of different ways that you can use advents, scraps, full skeins if you really wanted to. Back to the Mimicking Crochet Afghan train. This is the Incredible Blanket by Purl Soho. This is another free pattern. It is designed with fingering weight yarn. It does have a gauge. I don't think it's pertinent. It is 26 stitches by 44 rows to get 4 inches of knitting. This one I do think is not garter. I do believe you're going to have to purl on the wrong side, but the finished project, in my opinion, is totally worth it. So just keep that in mind. If you want something super, super mindless, this might not be the one because you're going to have to purl. You're also going to have to knit into the stitch below at certain points. So if that's something that you can't do super mindlessly, this one probably isn't for you. There is 1 size available with this blanket, but again, totally customizable, cast on as few or as many stitches as you want. But if you follow the pattern, you're going to get a blanket that is about 51 by 51 inches or 130 by 130 centimeters. There are instructions included on this pattern page for weaving in ends as you go. So if that's something you want to learn, it might even be worth just looking at the pattern page, or their website rather, to learn that, because I think it's a really valuable skill to know. And it's a free pattern, so why not take advantage of it? Otherwise, it's a really simple, easily memorizable pattern. Like I said, it's just knitting purling on the wrong side, and the odd knit into the stitch below. So yeah, I still think it's pretty mindless. I can purl without looking. I just have to make sure I remember that every time I flip, I have to pay attention to if I'm knitting or purling. This blanket might be a really fun one for using a magic knot ball. If you haven't heard of one of those before, there is a specific type of knot that you can use to knot your yarn together where it will not come apart. It's like impossible to pull it apart. And so people will use scrap yarn and knot it together and wind up a big, huge ball of yarn and then just start knitting with it. And I think this would be a great pattern to do that with. It would throw color changes in randomly throughout your blanket, but if you're looking for that really scrappy, I hate to say chaotic, but I can't think of another word. If you're looking for that sort of look with your blanket, I think this would be a really great one. And yeah, if you love the crochet granny stripe Afghans, crochet granny stripe blankets, this is a really great option if you're not a crocheter. Of course, every time I start to record, one of my neighbors pulls out a leaf blower. Hopefully I can get rid of that. Hopefully it's not too bad. If it is, I apologize, but this is the only time I have to record. So light is very hard to come by once it gets into the winter. So this is what we're working with, but thankfully you're not really looking at things I'm holding up on the screen. You're just listening to me talk. So I think it should be okay. The Little Squares Knitted Blanket by Julie Harrison is another kind of quilting-esque one. This one is designed for DK white yarn. Again, use fingering weight if you want. This one doesn't even have a gauge given, so I really think gauge is not important. It is a garter stitch blanket though, so if you're looking for something in garter, this is a great one. It is knit up out of individual strips of alternating color squares and rectangles of a contrast color. So you knit everything in the stripes and then you sew them together or seam them together to create the blanket. So there is a little bit of seaming involved, but you may be able to just knit all of those strips and then use a join as you go method to put it together as well. I think that will work just fine. So if you don't feel like seaming, that is probably what I would do. If you wanted to knit this with fingering weight yarn, like I said, you could just do fingering weight yarn, or you could hold your Advents double. I feel like you could probably even just do a gauge swatch and a little bit of math and figure out exactly how many stitches you need to cast on to get a perfect square and use up exactly one mini skein from your Advent, and that would be a great way to do it. Or you could just cast on the square as written in the pattern with fingering weight yarn and just make as many squares as you possibly could out of one mini skein. I don't think there's any real rules for any of these blankets. It's kind of whatever you want to do, and if you're really concerned about using up all the yarn, use it all up. You could also stripe these squares with 2 different mini skeins. That would be pretty. So many different options. I feel like I fly through talking about blankets in these videos, but it's because they're so open for interpretation. You can really do whatever you want. The pattern itself is just like a base starting point, and then from there you can go out and do literally whatever you want. You could take these squares and put some lace in them if you wanted to instead of the garter. It's really up to you. Speaking of lace squares, the Radvent Throw by Ambah O'Brien is designed to use up exactly 24 mini skeins. So this is one of those ones where I think gauge is a little bit more important. This is designed for fingering weight yarn, and its gauge is 17.5 stitches by 33 rows to get 4 inches or 10 centimeters of knitting in the lace pattern that is in the pattern. This one is made to be about 40 by 61 inches or 100 by 152.5 centimeters. Each square is designed to use up as much of the mini skein as absolutely possible, so that is why I say gauge is a little bit more important for this one, but it's also perfect for an Advent. And the more I look at this, the more I want to make a blanket out of my Advent using this pattern. But I'm also known to start blankets and never finish them, so we'll see. Anyways, each square is knit from the center out in the round, You get your little squares and then you connect all of them together with a very simple crochet join. You also could just mattress stitch them together. I do think the crochet join adds something to the blanket. It adds a little bit of texture to it, but if you're scared of crocheting, if you've never crocheted, you could easily just seam them together. Do whatever you want. There are charted and written instructions for the lace on this blanket, so depending on your preference, you have both of those available to you. I just think it's so pretty and classy, and I don't know, it lends itself really well to an Advent. It's designed exactly for an Advent. If you're looking for Advent patterns, even not blanket ones, Ambah is very, very good at Advent patterns. She comes out with at least a shawl every year. I'm not sure if she comes out with a blanket every year, but highly recommend her patterns. Also, as an aside, highly recommend Curious Handmade patterns. She usually comes out with some sort of throw or blanket every year as well. I haven't included any of her patterns in this video specifically, but they're worth checking out as well. So I will try and make sure to remember to link her patterns down below as well. The Quadrophenia by K.F. Jones is another pattern designed specifically for Advents, so I would say gauge is a little bit more important for this one. It is designed for fingering weight yarn as well, with a gauge of 22 stitches by 48 rows in garter stitch. This is going to give you a 42 by 42 inch or 107 by 107 centimeter blanket, and it is constructed modularly. So you're going to knit up first 4 different triangle shaped pieces, and then once those are knit together, I would recommend blocking them first and then you can seam them together, just so that you know you're going to get a really nice even seam, that everything is going to lay nicely and you're not going to get any buckling. But I do like that it's knit in the 4 pieces, because you're not going to get near the end of the blanket and have a really big, heavy, awkward thing that you can't carry around with you. You can take the yarn that you need for one triangle, take that on the go, and not have to worry about all of that bulk. So that's kind of nice. If you're a person who likes to bring knitting with you on the go, this might be a great pattern. Like I said, it's designed to maximize the use of mini skeins, so I would be a little bit more cognizant of your gauge for this one. Just pay attention to it and make sure you're about within the range so you don't run out of yarn, because that would really stink. If you're a person who does like video tutorials for your knitting patterns, this pattern does include them. You're going to have videos for both seaming and finishing the blanket, so that's something to keep in mind as well. If this is your first blanket and you're a little bit unsure, this one might be a great one because you have a little bit of extra hand holding. And finally, the Stamina by Camille Descoteaux is a pattern that sucked me in mostly because of the dog and the photos, if I'm being honest. But it's also a really, really pretty blanket, so if you look past the cute little puppy, it's a beautiful blanket. This is designed for fingering weight yarn. It has a gauge of 29 stitches by 32 rows in its mosaic pattern, and it is designed to use up a 24 mini skein advent as well. So keep that in mind when you're knitting it up and checking your gauge. There are 2 different options for the border on this pattern, so it's something you want to keep in mind because one of the options does use one of your mini skeins up. So kind of got to think this through at the beginning. You can either do an I-cord border on it that uses up one of your 24 advent minis, or you can do a garter stitch border, and you can make that border as thick or as thin as you want and use maybe a separate skein from your stash, or perhaps you have a full size skein for your 25th day of your advent. You could use that as well, but the garter stitch border gives you a little bit more room for changing the size of the blanket. The triangles that you see on this blanket are all knit individually and seamed together. I feel like you could do a join as you go method though as well if you wanted to. Do whatever you want. I don't know how many times I've said that in this video, but seriously, do whatever you want. It's a blanket. It'll look beautiful no matter what. The pattern does say it's easily customizable. Add or subtract as many triangles as you want. If the 24 triangles is too small for you, does it have a blanket size on here? Yes, it does, and I forgot to write it down. So with the I-cord border, so keeping the garter stitch border completely out of your mind, with the I-cord border and doing this with 24 mini skeins, it's going to be 40 by 44 inches or 102 by 112 centimeters. So if you want something bigger than that, just make more triangles and add more triangles. Very customizable. It also isn't just your typical boring square or rectangle blanket. You get a hexagon out of it, which I think is very cool. So if you don't want the boring square blanket, this might be a fun choice for you. Anyways, I feel like that's all I can say about all of these blankets. Like I said, they're also customizable and there's so much you can do with them that there isn't a lot of stringent measurements or yardage requirements or anything like that. It's kind of just a way to use up yarn in a fun way that creates a really beautiful piece for your home. And yeah, so hopefully this inspired you a little bit. Like I said, I'll link that other blanket video down below as well. I think there's 9 different blankets in that video, but they're also all blankets that are great for using scrap yarn. I think some of them in that video might even be crocheted as well. Don't quote me on it. But there are options there for you as well if you didn't see anything in today's video. But I hope this inspires you to maybe use up a lingering advent calendar or the miles and miles of scraps all of us knitters have kicking around, and use them up and make something that you're going to love and you're going to cherish for a long time. If you liked what you saw in today's video, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel out. You can also click that like button, and both of those things really help get this video out to other knitters just like you. And with that being said, I will see you next week for a regular podcast episode. Bye!